welcome to the 15th episode of the Veggies Abroad Vegan Travel Podcast with the chief veggie pusher, myself, Rebecca Gade Sawicki. Some of you may already be familiar with Veggies Abroad, but for those of you who aren't, we're a full-service vegan travel company that offers custom planning services, small group trips, a helpful blog chock full of just about everything a vegan or veg-curious traveler could possibly need to plan an adventure, and also this podcast. With this podcast, I hope to bring you guys the inside scoop of what vegan, vegan-friendly, and eco-friendly businesses are doing in the wide world of travel. Okay, so today's episode is cruising as bad as they say. Some of you are going to love me and agree with this conversation, while others of you might be a little less enthused. But these kinds of conversations are incredibly important to have in order to be more responsible travelers. I've said this before, and I will continue to say it. Where you spend your dollars matters. You're telling a company that you want more of what you're doing. And that could mean using renewable energy or dumping over 200,000 gallons, which is about 10 swimming pools, of human sewage into the ocean. I don't know about you, but that seems like a pretty easy answer to me. I have never been a fan of the cruise industry, even before starting a vegan travel company and becoming a travel advisor. Its environmental impacts are staggering. Cruise ships produce and dump large amounts of sewage and other waste, like millions of gallons, into our oceans, polluting our beaches, contaminating our coral reefs, and destroying our valuable marine ecology. Some of that waste is treated prior to dumping. Other waste is dumped directly into the ocean without a second thought. But that's not all. They also spew a whole host of pollutants into the air. Air quality on ships is notoriously problematic. They generate 8 times the amount of carbon emissions over a land-based itinerary, strain local infrastructures and services, contribute to over-tourism, create unequal economic impacts for local communities, and the list could go on and on. You might be thinking, how in the world can they get away with some of this? Or that I'm exaggerating. The global cruise industry is projected to generate around 30 billion, yes, billion with a B, in revenue this year. To put that into perspective, that's the GDP for small developing countries like El Salvador. They've got a ton of cash to make really slick marketing and to put out information about how they're becoming more eco-friendly, why you should travel with them, and why this is a good decision. So on the surface, it looks great. Hell, even some of them have come out with vegan menus, and I've seen media, especially vegan media, jump all over promoting that. Again, making people feel better about this decision and about spending their money there. The vast majority of people aren't going to look any further than that. And these companies know that. They just have to rope you in on like very small things. And then they know they've got you from there. Truth be told, most of these companies aren't getting any smaller and more conscious. They're actually getting larger and dirtier. For instance, this year, Royal Caribbean unveiled the largest cruise ship in the industry, the Icon of the Seas. This floating city can hold nearly 10,000 people. Yes, 10,000. Can you imagine the amount of waste and pollution something like that creates? Also, don't forget that when something like that is being driven through the water, other sea life is in danger of not only having their habitats destroyed, but also being killed. You cannot see a giant whale that is the size of a bus, mind you, driving something like that. As you can probably tell, these types of conversations really fire me up, and they also really fire up today's guest from the nonprofit organization Friends of Earth. Friends of Earth is on a mission to create a healthier and more just world. They're working to stop catastrophic climate change by promoting policies and actions that will cut carbon emissions, protect the world's oceans from oil drilling and pollution tied to plastics, cruise ships, and freight shipping, and rainforest destruction by challenging U.S. financial investments and import policies and supporting the land rights of indigenous communities around the world, promote clean energy solutions while protecting public lands and waters from fossil fuel development, develop a sustainable food system that decreases our reliance on carbon-intensive factory farming and harmful pesticides that have decimated bee and butterfly populations, and defend the Environmental Protection Agency, the Endangered Species Act, and other key environmental victories from attempts to be defunded or defanged. Whew. That is a lot. And joining me today is Marcie Keever, the author of Friends of the Earth's Cruise Ship Report Card. She has championed bans on ship sewage discharge in California, Washington, and national marine sanctuaries, and has a strong background in campaign implementation, expertise on air issues, and experience in dealing with agency relations and legislative initiatives. Previously, Marcie was the program director for San Francisco Beautiful and an attorney and Equal Justice Works Fellow for Our Children's Earth. She has done work for a number of environmental justice organizations, including as a staff attorney at the Golden Gate University Environmental Law and Justice Clinic. Marcie holds a JD from Golden Gate University School of Law and a BA from UC Santa Barbara. Let's get over to my interview with Marcie. Marcie, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time from saving the oceans and our world's waterways to chat with me.
I'm always happy to chat. It's really great to be here, Rebecca.
So first things first, let's start a little bit of background. And can you tell us a little bit about what Friends of Earth advocates for and a little backstory on the organization before we jump into your role?
Sure. Friends of the Earth has been around since 1969. We were founded in Berkeley, California, and San Francisco, in the Bay Area, by David Brower, our founder, who was the first president of the Sierra Club, and went on to found other environmental organizations, and have been working since the beginning to protect our oceans, our airsheds, our communities from the kinds of environmental pollution we see from various industries. And the cruise industry has been a big polluter problem for more than the past 20 years. And I've been at Friends of the Earth for 15 years, almost 16 now. I know. And pretty
That's
much
fantastic.
On day one, started working to pressure the cruise industry and really daylight the issues that the industry presents for ocean waters, for communities, for our air.
Perfect. So that's a great segue into my next question so let's talk a bit about what makes the cruise industry so detrimental to the environment. And is it only ocean cruising that's terrible? Or is river cruising also terrible too?
Well, ocean cruise ships are the biggest, okay, right? And they keep getting bigger. And ocean cruise liners, they're getting larger, more and more passengers. They're going more and more places, and their pollution footprint continues to grow. And so in looking at the biggest ships on down for the ocean cruise industry, we really see the big players be the biggest polluters, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And so then, following that same theme, what are the main impacts on the environment that the cruising industry plays a role in?
Everything from water pollution to air pollution to air toxics to CO2 emissions and methane. The cruise industry sort of runs the gamut of all those pollution sources. In addition, we're talking about noise pollution from their engines and their propellers, which is now considered to be a legitimate source of pollution, to, unfortunately, we just saw this past week hitting and killing whales when they're speeding through our oceans. So there's an incredible gamut of problems that the cruise industry presents, and there are things that are being done to try to reduce that footprint. But our opinion and the opinion of many other groups is that they need to do much, much more to really reduce their footprint on our environment, on our communities.
Yeah, of course. I saw that news report about the whale being run over. I'm not sure the best way to describe that.
They call it T-boned sometimes, right? Literally like the whales across the bow when it comes into port. Sometimes there are cases where the whale could already have been dead. And it basically picked it up in the ocean on the way. But these ships are so big they don't even see or notice that there's a whale across their bow, whether they've hit it or just picked it up, because they're so massive.
And that's such an incredible thing to think that everybody knows whales are massive. We're talking about school bus sized,
some of the largest creatures on the planet.
Yes. So to not be able to see it in this ship that you're in is just it blows my mind. It's tragic.
Yeah. Yes, it is. It really is. And there are things that are being done to try to prevent these types of tragic deaths from our endangered species, endangered whales. But unfortunately, it takes mandatory programs, regulations, and rules to really get the entire industry to change their behavior, because their priority is to make it to port on time. And in many cases, that means going faster and as fast as they can, and to the detriment of our, marine waters, marine species.
Yeah. Wow. To the detriment of a lot of things, and a lot of things that you guys talk about in your cruise report card that you put on your website. And I'm looking through it right now. There are a lot of F's and D's on this report card. And it's been a long time since I've been in school, but I don't recall an F or a D being a passing grade. Maybe that's changed, but I don't think so.
No. And we grade on a curve too, to try to at least allow some wiggle room, right? We're not trying to, be as harsh as possible because, however, the industry would disagree. And I think they don't like being in school again. Nobody does once we've been through it. But, the industry has really flown under the radar when it comes to their environmental pollution. And when they have been caught and prosecuted, most of the time it's whistleblowers that are, officers on the ship or other workers, usually higher up in the sort of chain of command, since they feel a bit more secure in, whistleblowing on their company because they know that job is gone once they've done that. But the most recent example is the prosecution of Carnival Corporation, which is the largest cruise company in the world. I think now up to 10 brands under its corporate umbrella. And Carnival was caught back in 2005 is when they started seeing this pollution, that this whistleblower got off a ship in the UK and told the UK Coast Guard, Carnival Corporation is headquartered in the United States in Florida, but it's an offshore corporation. It's a foreign corporation registered in other countries. Almost every single one of its ships but one is flagged in another country. In many cases, places like Panama or the Marshall Islands, which are considered flags of convenience. And the rules in those countries are what apply to these ships when they're on the open waters, on the open ocean. And they don't necessarily care so much about environmental regulations, worker regulations, taxes, right? Carnival Corporation paid less than 3%, less than 1% in taxes back when the New York Times looked at it before the pandemic in the United States. And those are legal loopholes that they can use to not pay taxes, and they're not a U.S. corporation. So there are fewer and fewer rules that apply to them. And so this pollution started happening in 2005, just as all the big cruise companies were getting off of federal probation. They were all busted in the early 2000s, late 90s for environmental pollution, oily water pollution, oily waste. The Coast Guard had infrared video in the night of these oil sheens behind cruise ships for these big companies and fined them in the millions of dollars at the time. And they were all on probation for 5 years. And then this pollution starts happening again almost immediately when Princess, one of the Carnival companies, came off of probation. And, so then I think the, U.S. and the Department of Justice started investigating. And finally, in 2016, late 2016, this huge prosecution got announced. And, $40 million fine, which was the largest fine against a shipping company at the time, and probably still is. And yet, Carnival Corporation is a $3 billion a year profit company before the pandemic.
It's a drop in the bucket.
And so a drop in the ocean. Yeah, drop in the ocean. And it's,
yes.
And then spent 5 years unable to come into compliance. So there's an incredible amount of legal pollution that the shipping industry can emit. They don't have to emit, water that is completely pristine, or air, they emit air pollutants out of their stack, their smokestacks. And so they do have the legal right to pollute, but there are levels that they have to meet. And yet we just watched them. And then, about a year in, less than a year in, the, court appointed monitors telling the court, there's thousands of violations out there. And, all the evidence, we have it all from all the court files, and hauls in, Mickey Arison, who's the head of the board of directors, used to be the CEO, all the leadership, and threatens to put them in jail if they don't take this prosecution and criminal probation seriously. It didn't happen, right? That was highly unlikely, but, fined them another $20 million. And even after 5 years, they reduced the amount of violations, but they were still violating. And unfortunately, it's a part of a corporate culture that prioritizes their profits over the environment, over the health of the communities that they depart from and travel to, and frankly, the health of our climate. This is an industry that's now doubling down on liquefied natural gas as a sort of transitional fuel, when we know that the amount of methane that is emitted, which is like 40 times the climate-forcing pollutant as CO2, is incredible from the LNG engines, from the extraction and movement of LNG around the world. And yet we finally, just this year, saw Royal Caribbean say, yeah, we kind of know now that this isn't the best fuel, and we're looking at, and it's like, well, then you, in my opinion, you should have delayed the launch of the next newest biggest cruise ship in the world.
Yes.
Because our climate can't afford to have any more of these emissions. But that's not the priority of this for-profit corporation. They're responsible to their shareholders. Unfortunately, not the environment, not communities that are suffering from the effects of climate change, the effects of the pollution that comes out of their smokestacks, and the effects of the water pollution that they put into our oceans.
No, they can easily hide that and put it behind slick marketing and make people think that they are doing something, really great for this community, or that they have greened up their ships, or I don't know. I've seen it all. They do all kinds of things to make people believe that what they're paying for isn't as bad as it is. But that's not the reality.
I was just going to say, I was in Juneau, Alaska, at a conference, and also, visiting with some activists in Juneau who are trying to push back against the cruise industry there. And in the height of summer, they'll have 5 to 6 cruise ships in that very tiny community in Alaska, though it is the capital.
And to pause on that, so people know, 5 to 6 cruise ships equates to well over 10,000 people easily, depending on how large these cruise ships are.
Pretty much is 3,000 plus passengers and crew.
Like, this is significant.
Sometimes there might be a smaller one in port, but it's incredibly significant. Yeah. I'd have to look at the population of Juneau. Yeah. But at a minimum, doubles the population. It gets close to that. And this tiny downtown, many of the businesses are owned or partially owned by the cruise industry. The amount of money that they unfortunately extract from this community and many communities around the U.S. is much, much more than they actually put back in. Yes. And they make all these claims about how much their passengers spend, but if you're on board, there's seminars on how to shop in the ports that you go to.
You're spending it with them.
And yes, and the land-based tours that they advertise and talk about. You can go and hike the glacier, and go on hikes to see bears and all the things that you might do in Alaska. But they, in many cases, they either own those tour companies that they direct you to, or they take a cut of those tours. And we've been told by one company in the Caribbean that the cruise industry came to them and said, "Oh, hey, we want to send our passengers on your land-based, Jeep tours or whatever they do in the Caribbean." And they said, "Oh, okay, so what would the deal be?" And they said, "We take 90% of your fare."
Oh my God! Wow.
And they said, "Well, thank you, but no. How could we even continue to operate?" But in a place like Juneau, Alaska, the communities in the Caribbean, literally tourism is the lifeblood of their economy in many cases. And so sometimes there really is no choice, because now your community is flooded with cruise ship passengers. Key West is another that's really tried to just limit the amount of passengers that are coming, and, a huge impact on your infrastructure. In Juneau, I was watching, rows and rows of buses waiting for the season to really kick in. There was only one cruise ship in port when I was there in April. But I couldn't even fathom what it would be like with 5 or 6 cruise ships in port. No. You can't even, I experienced other, small tourist towns, and there were places you're just like, it's the summertime and the land-based tourists are too much. I'm not going to go here, there, or go to downtown or whatever it might be. And so I can imagine that's what it's like in Key West or Bar Harbor, Maine, or Juneau, Alaska.
Yeah, you're elbow to elbow with people.
And then add cruise ship passengers in.
No.
So a community like Santa Barbara has said, first of all, they don't let the cruise ships come in the summer months. In June, July, and August. They only come in the shoulder seasons.
Oh, smart.
And then now they're putting a cap on the amount of cruise ships that can come each season. And Catalina is doing the same thing off of, Avalon, off of Los Angeles. And, the concern is that because if Catalina does it, then more ships will come to Santa Barbara, because there's not another place that's sort of equivalent in Southern California to those two places. So we really see that push and pull depending on the community you're in of, well, we're just going to go somewhere else. So we'll take our money and go elsewhere, but not accounting for this incredible impact that the ships have on, again, the community and the environment.
Yeah, it is a multi-pronged thing. The cruise industry doesn't just affect what's living in the oceans, but it's everything. The air we breathe, the people, it's awful. So back to your report card, let's break down a few of the different areas that are on here to analyze like what you guys are looking at when you're grading these things and what people might not know is associated with some of these problems. And so the first area is sewage treatment. Can you talk a little bit about what that means, what's being dumped, where things are being dumped? Right.
And so sewage treatment is about the systems that they've installed on board. If you have a ship with a toilet, you have to install some sort of holding tank up to a treatment system. Yeah. And on a smaller boat, it would be, either a holding tank that you would pump out on shore, or potentially go far enough out to dump because you don't treat it, putting in a chlorine tablet, right? Like that, people potentially, if they've been on boats, sort of know how lovely the head is. And so, but these big ships have a treatment system. And there are, standards in place federally in the Clean Water Act that require you to do some level of treatment and meet a level of pollution before you discharge your wastewater. And unfortunately, those standards were put into the Clean Water Act, around in the early 80s, and have never been updated. So we have a very weak federal requirement, and similarly relatively weak international requirements. So sort of anywhere in the ocean, and once these systems are installed and inspected by the Coast Guard on these ships, no one is keeping track of how they're doing. So there's the problem.
So they could get away with anything,
potentially. And, the only investigations and prosecutions that we've seen have been by, in the main, for things like oily waste, like what happened with Carnival, what happened with all the companies back in the early 2000s. And we see very little prosecution for any of this sort of routine wastewater discharge. The only place that was taking a look was the state of Alaska, because they saw an explosion of the number of cruise ships that were coming in the early 2000s. Yeah. They had 10 calls a year back in the late 90s, 10 ships showing up over the whole entire season. And now it's hundreds. It's up to like 600 that come up into Alaska. And so they were very, very concerned that their fishery is incredibly important and that this water pollution was going to be a huge problem. And so they put state requirements in place. It pushed and was stronger than what was required at the federal level. The systems that are installed are called marine sanitation devices. And then they've installed, they've basically improved, technology's improved in particular because Alaska pushed it, to basically have these advanced sewage treatment systems. So they have sort of more filters on the back end to make sure that you get more of the fecal coliform bacteria taken out, more of the, the really, the E. coli and anything else that you might find in sewage pollution. And so there's been advancements, and that's how we look at it in our report card is, whether they have installed advanced sewage treatment systems or still relying on these older marine sanitation devices. That's one place the industry pushed in particular by Alaska, that then the technology is available so you can have these better systems that treat to a better standard. The industry will say it's a drinking water quality wastewater. I'm not going to be drinking what comes out of that wastewater.
My God.
Yeah, they like to say that.
Yeah, no thanks.
And they like to say that this is much, much better than land-based sewage treatment. And in some cases, they're right. We have communities that cannot get their land-based sewage treatment up to a point where they have releases and pollution problems. However, those systems are monitored, if hourly, if not daily, right? They are being looked at all the time. The, communities can sue under the Clean Water Act for the violations if they do have them. An overflow, a mistake, a stormwater discharge is a big event.
Sure.
But this is a daily event in the cruise industry's world. And so what some communities and states have done is said, our state's a no discharge zone. Out to 3 nautical miles, which is a nautical mile is slightly larger than a regular mile. So it's about 4 regular miles, but out to those in-state waters is a no discharge zone. California has done that. Puget Sound has done that. Almost the entire coast of New England is almost entirely covered by a no discharge zone. And in some cases, sort of region by region has built this sort of, at least close to shore, you can't discharge anything from a boat, big or small. Mm-hmm. And so, but trying to make sure that the enforcement is there, that nobody is discharging is the challenge. And in my opinion, you shouldn't be able to discharge anything close to shore, no matter what, where you are. And more and more places are trying to do that, but the entire Southeast, the Gulf Coast, there's almost zero no discharge zones. And Alaska put this strong program in place, and it has slowly been cut back. So we grade them on whether they have these advanced sewage treatment systems or not. But we used to give them an A, and now we're like, we don't know how they're operating. So you fail if you don't have one, and you get a C if you do.
On your list.
So, and we've talked to some of the industry. It's like, are you guys going to show us, how you operate? And, again, I'm not a government, so I'm not in the, I unfortunately don't have that authority, but, we really want to encourage the industry to come up to what's technologically available.
Right.
And then in some fashion, we're continuing to push for actual oversight of how they operate because we have so little information on how they do.
Hey there, fantastic listeners. Let's hit pause on this episode for a thrilling announcement, a golden ticket to Globetrot with Veggies Abroad. Veggies Abroad isn't just your go-to for vegan guides and trip planning tips. It's your passport to extraordinary small group journeys, carefully crafted by the ultimate veggie pusher and your favorite podcast host, me, Rebecca Gade Sawicki. I've spent countless hours researching the best vegan hotels, food, and experiences, and now I'm bringing those experiences directly to you. Join me and my newfound veggie pals on escapades to exciting and exotic destinations around the world. Whether it's trekking through the Thai jungle to witness elephants in their natural habitat, or staying at a carbon-neutral camp in Kenya during the Great Migration, our adventures are nothing short of spectacular. And guess what? Those aren't the only exciting trips awaiting you. So what are you waiting for? Cruise on over to veggiesabroad.com pronto. Well, how about after this episode is over to explore our dazzling lineup of 2024 trips and secure your spot on your next vegan adventure today. That's just, with the amount of money that these companies are bringing in, this is a no-brainer. Make the change.
And I will say that companies launching new ships are finally, everyone's pretty much has an advanced wastewater treatment system. That's important. I'm glad they're doing that. And so it's one place where I think the industry has improved. And yet we still don't, it's not perfect, right? We want to see more enforcement. We want to actually see how these systems operate, and not have to rely on a whistleblower that they have a magic pipe that's bypassing their treatment system. So.
Yeah, that's outrageous.
Yeah.
I can't, just amazes me. So the next one up is air pollution. Let's talk a little bit about how terrible the diesel is that's being belched into the air. And there are ways that companies are trying to say they improve it, but they're not actually improving it. They're just moving one pollution to another area.
And so, yes, cruise ships and all ocean-going vessels in the past have used what's called bunker fuel or heavy fuel oil. If you Google that, you can see it's basically sludge at room temperature. It's sort of the bottom of the barrel. They take every other sort of jet fuel and gasoline and diesel off the top of that barrel of oil. And what's left is known as residual fuel, heavy fuel oil, bunker fuel. And ships' engines were engineered to burn this residual fuel. And so that has, due to advocacy from Friends of the Earth and many other groups around the world, has shifted, and cleaner fuel is now required, around the world. And the U.S. and Canada have put in this additional protections to require even cleaner fuel when you come into U.S. or Canadian waters. And it's called an emission control area, and it's sort of this protective bubble. It goes out to 200 nautical miles. So you have to use cleaner fuel. Unfortunately, there's alternative compliance. You can use a scrubber, an exhaust gas scrubber, which is a system that basically sort of scrubs the smokestack of these ships. So you can continue to use a dirtier fuel and scrub the emissions out of your smokestack to comply with these cleaner fuel requirements. And so it's incredibly frustrating, because when scrubbers really started to become a technology was when, these cleaner fuel requirements got put into place before scrubbers were really even a viable alternative. And no one, including environmentalists and scientists, even thought that scrubbers would become a thing. So, and then they did. And the cruise industry
the scrubbing goes into the water, right?
Well, there's it depends. There's a couple different kinds of scrubbers. The main one that's used by a lot in the cruise industry is a wet scrubber. So essentially sprays water mist into your smokestack to sort of pull out those pollutants. And it generates wastewater. And that wastewater there are some standards for it, but it's still incredibly acidic, full of things like PAHs and heavy metals, the sort of pollution you see from petroleum, burning petroleum. And it's essentially those wet scrubbers have converted their air pollution into wastewater pollution, and it's being dumped in our oceans in significant volumes. And it's incredibly concerning. And Friends of the Earth and others are working from the international level on down to try to restrict the scrubber use in international waters, in waters close to shore. There are many, many ports and jurisdictions around the country do not allow the wastewater to be dumped in their ports, in their jurisdictions, and that list is growing. The Port of Seattle is one. California's clean fuel rule for ships, which was also being pushed along with the international rules, doesn't allow for this alternative compliance. So when cruise ships come into California waters, out to, I think, 24 nautical miles, they have to use cleaner fuel. And they can do it, but cleaner fuel costs more. And it's much, much cheaper to install a scrubber and make your money back by buying cheaper fuel. They've paid for all those scrubber installations. Now, once they're installed, it does not take very long, a couple years, to pay back that scrubber installation price because you can continue to buy cheaper fuel. And the cruise industry needs to put their money where their mouth is. They're literally continuing to shoot for the floor, to lobby to keep restrictions as minimum as possible so they can continue to line their pocketbooks while, yes, taking people on vacation. And it's really frustrating because we just continue to see the industry double down on things like liquefied natural gas, which, yes, has a different pollution profile from heavy fuel oil. However, we talked about this. It's a huge methane generator and a huge climate forcer, and is really just unacceptable when it comes to making it some sort of transition or bridge fuel. And, these cruise ships continue to go further and further afield into the Arctic, into the Antarctic, and contributing to climate change, to ice melt in the Arctic, and just, we're getting to a point where, this isn't, someone called it extinction tourism. And it wasn't me, but I think that it is definitely a label that we can put on these cruise ships, especially ones that go further and further north. This year, some really big cruise ships are going up into Nome, Alaska, and Prudhoe Bay up on the North Slope. These communities they don't even have public restrooms, let alone like the ability to handle the kind of passengers just in their infrastructure. I don't know how we're going to continue to sustain this industry in the demands they put on our communities and our environment. The ocean dilution is not the solution to pollution, as I have people like to say. So, again,
they keep going into more and more sensitive areas. They're causing destruction. They're causing the life to be killed. Coral reefs are in danger. Right. I mean, it's so many things. So many things that I think about, other generations are only going to see in books because we have not taken care of it. And, certain industries are at fault. They have blood on their hands for these things.
Yeah. And the cruise industry is one of many. And so they're not solely responsible for all of this. But their marketing and the way they talk about it is that they're not responsible at all. And those things,
at all. Yeah.
They're not responsible for the life cycle emissions of liquefied natural gas. They're sticking their heads in the sand. That's not like you can't. It's
it's not me. I didn't do it.
2024. You can't be saying things like, oh well, now we know that LNG. It's like, no, I know that this ship was commissioned in 2016, but your priority is to launch the ship, not to think about how you might actually change and transition away from the fuel that you're using.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. And so this isn't on the card, but I know that it is also problematic is shore power. And I've heard quite a few or some cruise companies have said this to me that, now that they're plugging in, they have this ability. But the fact of the matter is it's like less than 2% of the world's ports have plug-in capabilities. And many of these ships don't really have that ability either. So when they're going into port, they're belching all of this garbage into the air for people to breathe. And, then the other toxicity that's going into the water and everything else, because these ships have to maintain regular operations while they're sitting there. Is this something that is supposed to get better or could make the entire experience better?
I mean, shore power is incredibly important. I think it does. You turn your engines off and plug into cleaner shore-based power. Even if you were like entirely coal-fired, providing that power from all coal-fired power plants, which isn't even happening in this country anymore. It's still more efficient there's just because you're not providing all of that power just to the cruise ship. And again, we're not, coal-fired power, thankfully, is disappearing in this country. And so, but it's an infrastructure problem, right? Do you have enough? Do communities? Juneau, Alaska does have one cruise ship terminal, and they're trying to figure out how they can do another one. But in smaller communities or the developing world, it's really not an option. They don't have enough power for their land-based communities, right? Exactly. And so, and again, you can't run an extension cord from the dock, and so it's an important piece. And the cruise industry should be installing it on their ships and helping ports bring that electrical outlet to the docks, because ports historically were, it's called bunker fuel because ships used to run on coal. And then they took coal from the bunker and put it in the, into the burner for the engine. And that's obviously not the case anymore. We don't have coal fired. There might be a few left around, maybe in the Great Lakes and maybe in some other places, but the historic ships. But it's really, really important to electrify at our ports, both the onshore facilities, the trucks, all the things, because in particular, not in cruise ship ports necessarily, they're in more less industrial places in various communities, usually sort of downtown or on the waterfront, not the working waterfront, the more tourist waterfront. But all of that is helpful to those communities to just sort of cut off those emission sources at the source. But we need more ports with it. We need more ships with it. And we need the industry sort of adopt it across the board and support it in these communities that don't necessarily have the ability to bring that infrastructure, to every ship that shows up. Juneau has one plug-in. 5 or 6 ships in at a time is, you can see the smokestack emissions, even though they are cleaner, I put quotes around that, with those scrubber uses, because it cleans the smokestack, but we're not looking at what's coming out the wastewater pipe.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love the people who say that it's cleaner to have to then go and stand next to it for the day and breathe all that. Is that really going to be the choice you're going to make? No, you're not going to want to, or you wouldn't want to send your child to do it either.
No, and it's actually harmful to cruise ship passengers, what comes out of those smokestacks. Yeah. It is. You don't want to be on the back of the ship underneath the smokestacks. You get this greasy film on you. It's really
sick.
Yeah.
It's so gross.
Yeah. And it's, our colleagues at other organizations have taken air emissions testing equipment onto cruise ships. They'll never be able to do it again, but they did it this one time, right? And did report about it and how unhealthy it is on the decks of the cruise ships as well. So, it's frustrating.
Speaking of electricity, I have had a couple cruise lines tell me that they are looking to go all electric. I have a hesitation on that, but I'm curious from your standpoint, is going all electric with a ship even possible? Is it better for the environment? Because now we have to talk about the battery disposal.
Right. I do think, it's a similar discussion around electric cars, right? But I do think that from a climate perspective, from an air emissions perspective, whether it's sulfur, whether it's particulate matter, that is the direction that we need to be going. And I think there are some ships that are hybrid right now. A company called Hurtigruten, which operates mostly in Scandinavia, and closer to shore, has at least one, if not more, hybrid ships that do have batteries on board. That doesn't account for their entire trip, depending, and you have to be closer to shore, and so things like ferries and other smaller ships that may take passengers, but are sort of a daily, going to different ports, are, I think, early adopters of those either hybrid or full-on battery technology. And when you're, doing ocean-going cruises, that's a lot. Just the weight alone, and how far you are from ports. Absolutely. And the ability to charge. So, but I do think that's an incredible and important step because, we are, of course, concerned about the extraction of, these minerals so you can make these batteries, but we've already extracted an incredible amount of these minerals and can, just looking at recycling and reusing any of these things is incredibly important. And from a community health perspective, cutting off those CO2 emissions, cutting off those criteria pollutant emissions, and, making back those, just cutting off those climate emissions, that needs to be the priority. And we need to figure out how to do it right. But, that's what research and development is for with these big companies. That's how we need to figure it out and actually address the life cycle emissions, the life cycle problems when it comes to minerals that are being used for batteries and, are sort of turning away from our disposable culture.
And so when people are thinking about planning their vacation, is cruising worse than flying and having like a full-blown land-based itinerary?
From comparing just a cruise vacation versus a land-based vacation. Our analysis of a land-based vacation in Seattle versus a cruise departing from Seattle, heading to Alaska and back, is that the land-based vacation, the cruise vacation has a CO2 footprint that is 8 times higher than the land-based vacation.
That's incredible.
It's incredible. And we used, available online calculators for this. This is not just some sort of fuzzy math that I made up in my head. And in many cases, you fly to get to Seattle, or you fly to get to wherever your vacation may go, whether it's land or sea. But we didn't even look at the airfare, or the aircraft CO2 emissions, which are problematic as well. And I try to think about that when it comes to my work life and my, travel life. Like, is it worth the CO2, right? Should we take this vacation on an airplane? We even looked, someone emailed me and asked me, well, what about if you drove to Juneau from Seattle? And I think the CO2 emissions were like twice as much for the cruise. It was better to drive. And you can't drive to Juneau. You have to get on a ferry, I think. You have to get on a car ferry to actually reach Juneau in a car. But I mean, it's incredible. And so we haven't really dug in on the sort of airline trip versus a cruise vacation. But all things being equal, just the vacation itself, whether it's a cruise or on land, it's better to choose the land-based vacation every time if you're concerned about CO2 emissions in our climate.
And when you were doing that analysis, you weren't looking at like staying at hostels and only taking mass transit. It was, I think I remember seeing it was like a 4-star hotel, like you had private transportation.
Yeah, we looked at taking ride shares and, ride hailing stuff or taking cabs and going whale watching, going out on a boat. We looked at the impact of those, a higher end vacation and what it would be on a cruise, and it's still 8 times higher. It's incredible. Of course, you could reduce your footprint even further on land if you do things like take public transit and do things that are lower carbon. And so that just gets even higher, the difference between the two. And I understand people are going to continue to cruise. It's not it's not what I would choose, and it never has been even before I did this work, but it is something that people are going to choose. And that's what I appreciate about our cruise report card, is that you can actually look, there is a difference between these companies, that they, they're using better technology on board some of these ships. They're being transparent with us when it comes to us asking about what technology have you installed? What fuel are you using? How is your operating behavior? And so we give them A's when they're transparent with us. And I'm hopeful that we're going to continue to do that for this next report card, because that's what they need to be doing, not just with us, but with their passengers, with the governments that oversee them. They need to be honest about their footprint and how they're impacting communities and our environment.
Yeah, absolutely. Companies cannot continue to just think that they operate within a vacuum. They affect everything, like not just their passengers, not just their employees. They affect the entire world. It is all connected, and they can never forget that. And they have a responsibility to make sure that they are, honest and take care of these things. We don't have resources that will go on and on forever. These resources have an end life. And I think in some cases, we're starting to see the end life for some of those things. And that's terrifying.
Yes. Yes.
Are there any emerging technologies that you think show promise to improve things within the cruise industry?
Definitely. We talked a bit about hybrid ships and battery powered ships. We're seeing things like cargo ships and other types of large vessels use, wind assist with, sails that actually help them burn less fuel, and other sort of things to sort of cut that footprint. And we're also seeing things like green hydrogen is one that's being talked about. Hydrogen that's actually produced from green sources of power, and renewable sources of power. That's a potential for especially ship fuel, because it does take an incredible amount of fuel to push these ships through our oceans. And again, things like hybrid battery assist technology. And frankly, just getting smaller. I mean, that's another option, right? Not building yet another biggest cruise ship in the world.
I was going to say, we don't need another icon of the seas.
No, and there's going to be another one. And they just keep,
no.
I know. And it is, the Atlantic just published an article called Crying Myself to Sleep on the Icon of the Seas, or the largest cruise ship in the world. And
I have to look for that.
Most of the focus was on the experience, right? Because this is a travel writer, but they do talk about like getting up to the port and there's like a field of Teslas sitting over there. And I'm not necessarily a Tesla advocate, but at least it was an electric car, and the juxtaposition between that and this massive cruise ship, and just the sort of isolation that was felt on this, despite being on board with close to 10,000 passengers and crew. So
that is that's a small city. That's bigger than some small towns. Right. That's an incredible amount of human beings.
Yeah.
That's an incredible amount of waste.
Yeah. No, it's an incredible amount of waste, an incredible amount of human beings. It's environmental pollution. It's frankly human pollution. And unfortunately, people call, me and others snobs when we talk about this, like somehow it's about the individuals on board. And no, it's about this collective impact that is presented by this massive piece of infrastructure moving through our seas, polluting all the way.
Yeah, the entire way.
Yeah.
So to wrap this up, and I know this is probably some people are thinking this and wondering this as we come to the end, are there any cruise companies that are doing a good job, or maybe a little better job?
Yeah. I would point to our report card and say, the ones that are at the top are ones that are doing better. There's a couple, Regent Seven Seas and Disney, even though, again, I hesitate to even say I'm going to recommend this as a cruise line to take, because Disney's last ship that's being launched and the one that's being launched this year are both LNG ships. And before that, their 4 ships that were in their fleet, now they're going to have 6. Their 4 ships were using cleaner fuel everywhere, not using heavy fuel oil, and didn't have scrubbers on board because they didn't have to scrub. They're spending money on cleaner fuel. And they were transparent with us when it came to their operations and what technology they'd installed on board. And at the same time, they continued to push to purchase islands or parts of islands in the Caribbean so they can have their own private beach for their passengers, and are basically sort of carving out areas in places that, and all the big cruise companies do this, either have private islands or private beaches on islands in the Caribbean in particular, where they don't have to let anybody else in. And I understand that this is a tourist-based economy in a developing part of the world, that, this is seen sort of as the only option, that they sell off and have allowed to be privatized parts of their, island or entire islands. And, the dock has to be like a mile long for these massive ships to even get close to the island to offboard passengers. It's incredible. And so Disney has been, though it is at the top of our report card, or up at the top, it's been incredibly disappointing in the last few years. Yeah. And we've dinged their grade because they because they continue to, and frankly, go in the wrong direction when it comes to what we're looking for in, bumping up these companies and having them at the top. And so I continue to say there's options if you want to cruise, but it's not my recommendation.
Or maybe a sailboat would be better.
A smaller boat.
A sailboat, a canoe, a kayak.
And, smaller boats, river cruises, they use cleaner fuel, they use, wind technology, but it's unfortunately not accessible to many people. And, the cruise industry has this market where if they can't fill the boat, they start discounting those tickets to make it, because they have to put that boat out full to really make the most money possible. And so it makes it really, really easy to just say, oh, look, we can get this cruise for what it would cost in a land-based hotel. And then they provide everything else. They provide the food, they provide the drinks, they provide the entertainment for the cost of what it would cost just for the hotel on a land-based vacation. But,
they have an unfortunate ability to heavily discount things.
Yeah. And, I do think that more and more people are really thinking about the bigger footprint of the activities we take. Not everyone, but that's why we continue to encourage people to look at our report card and make choices that way and talk about the alternatives and, why those are important, especially for our climate.
Yeah, absolutely. Marcie, it was lovely chatting with you. I really appreciate you taking the time today. If people want to learn more about your work, where should they go?
They should go to our website. It's Friends of the Earth, www.foe.org. And if you just Google the cruise ship report card, you can find our report card directly on the internet. It's usually the first thing that pops up, which I really appreciate everyone taking a look. And, make that informed choice. Take a look at what's out there. And I really appreciate people thinking beyond just the destination or where they want to go or what they want to do and thinking about their impact when they get there.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. If you did, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. If you'd also like to learn more about upcoming Veggies Abroad tours or get additional travel help, visit veggiesabroad.com and also join our newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date with loads of new content, like where to find gorgeous vegan hotels, what to eat in cities around the world, trip planning tips, and so much more. Well, that's all I've got for now. Until next time.